the Soviet Union's invasion and occupation of Czechoslovakia post-World War II, do you think it gives us today some perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what we can learn?
There are definitely strong connections between what the Soviet Union did in Czechoslovakia in 1968 and what Russia, the Russian Federation, is doing in Ukraine today. A parallel that, of course, is not lost on either the Czech Republic, Slovakia, or any of the other countries of Eastern Europe who have been, much more vocal in their support of Ukraine and are really trying to drag the Western European countries and the North American members of NATO more, to give more support for Ukraine. And basically what it is the irony of the Soviet Union saying it was an anti-imperialist country and that the United States and the West were all imperialists, which, yes, it was true. But the Soviet Union was really no different. And this was an empire. And their invasion, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, was basically an effort to keep a country from spinning out of that empire, because what the reforms of the Prague Spring that were led by First Secretary Alexander Dubček were not only in terms of liberalization and freedom of speech and some increasing the space for private enterprise in a market economy, but also was moving toward non-alignment in foreign affairs.
Like Ukraine.
Exactly.
You used the phrase the Russian Federation for today's government, and I think that's interesting that it seems almost parallel to Union.
Right.
Yeah.
Because what Putin is trying to do is recreate he's basically bringing the band together. He basically is trying to take over the members of the USSR. And ultimately, and he said it himself, ultimately the countries that were, quote, satellite nations of the Warsaw Pact. And that includes Poland, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Romania. So, he is not going to stop with Ukraine. And he has said that, and there's no reason that we should not believe him.
You have written on your webpage that you and your husband traveled widely, and
Yes.
that was part of your drive to write about many cultures, and because you've written about Chile and
Right.
and your interests are wide. But why in particular Czechoslovakia? What took you to this deep dive into the Velvet Revolution and then the impact of everything?
Well, I've always been interested in human rights, and Václav Havel is kind of a hero of mine. Yes. But I think that a lot of, why I focus specifically on the events after 1968 in Czechoslovakia had a lot to do with my writing and translating that was set in a very different country, Portugal.
Yes.
Which during the same era was a fascist country where people had no rights, and particularly was an oppressive place for women, which is what some of my writing is about. And I had translated a picture book that came out in 2017 from Enchanted Lion called Three Balls of Wool Can Change the World.
Yes.
By Enriqueta Cristina and illustrated by Yara Kono. And this was the story of a family that had been close to Enriqueta's family that had been forced to flee Portugal because for political reasons. And some of the members of the family were in fact imprisoned under the brutal Salazar dictatorship in Portugal.
All right.
They fled Portugal. They ended up in Czechoslovakia.
Okay.
They thought they were going to be free there because, you know, that is kind of what the communist propaganda said. And, you know, when you're in a country that has an enemy and your country is oppressive, you tend to idealize the enemy. And you think that things are better there than they really are. And there was also some of that, and I know a review talked about it, in the way that the characters in Torch idealize the West. But in this case, the family fled to Czechoslovakia, and they did not find the freedom they were seeking.
This is for the family in Portugal.
The family in Portugal, the Torres family. And ultimately, they ended up leaving.
Okay.
But when I was researching the background for that book and for another book that I was working on at the time, and I can't say anything more about it.
The verse novel.
Yes.
Okay.
I read a memoir by another Portuguese political exile who had ended up in Czechoslovakia. And she lived through the Prague Spring. She supported the reforms. And she found herself in hot water with the communist dictatorship in 1968 and 69 after the Soviet Union had marched in and occupied the country. So I wanted to write about the people, and she wrote about this student, the university student, Jan Palach, who in January 1969 set himself on fire to protest both the occupation and the Czechoslovak people's passivity in the face of it, because he felt that people were just kind of accommodating themselves to the new regime. And they'd lost all interest in reforms. They'd lost all interest in having freedom. They'd lost all interest in being able to read books that they were enjoying before. They just gave that up. And he was hoping that his sacrifice would ignite a rebellion against the Soviet occupiers. And he wrote a letter. It was called Torch Number 1, in which he said that there were other people, other young people, waiting to do the same thing if there wasn't a popular uprising. And in fact, 1 month later, a high school student set himself on fire in Prague, a young man named Jan Zajec. And it was actually Jan Zajec's story that became the model for Pavel and Torch.
Okay.
But this journalist from Portugal lived through that and wrote about it. And she had attended Jan Palach's funeral before the government decided that, you know, allowing the funeral to take place and allowing people to talk about what had happened was going to ignite a popular rebellion. So they crushed all mention of the sacrifice of any young people who followed in Jan Palach's footsteps.
Okay.
And that's where the repression comes from against the three friends, Pavel's three mutual best friends in Torch. And she was torn because she had no place to go. If she did not if she did not knuckle under to the new regime in Czechoslovakia, they would imprison her or they would deport her back to Portugal. So she ended up, and she would not have a living, and she was a journalist. I mean, she was making a good living. So she ended up, this woman whose memoir I read, she ended up for a while kind of following the rules and kowtowing to the regime until she just couldn't take it anymore. And during a liberalization in Portugal in the early 1970s, she returned to Portugal and broke off her ties with the Communist Party, which, by the way, the leadership of the Portuguese Communist Party supported the tanks. They were what we now call the term tanky.
Yeah.
Refers to far leftists or, doctrinaire communists who supported Soviet intervention in places like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland.
Tankies thing.
Tankies, yes. So, certain journalists on the left, I won't mention names, but, the term tanky has been used to describe them.
Now, so are you ever tempted to write adult fiction or never? You have your audience in mind that you want to tell this story to?
Yes. I actually have written adult fiction, and I had an adult book published many, many years ago called Dirt Cheap. It was an eco-thriller. It did not do well. And I just think that, and a lot of people said that the most interesting characters in that book were the young people.
Okay.
Yes. So I think that, I really like telling the stories of young people who are idealistic in experiencing things for the first time.
Well, you have quite a range of characters, and I did read that Czechoslovakia was a very multi-ethnic place, or people from many, many different cultures and many religious traditions. And so it makes sense that, we've got Lida, who is Roma, and her father.
She's actually not Roma. She's accused, or, because her father has lived kind of a transient life. She is seen by other, by the mainstream kids at her school as Roma, and she has a friend who's Roma, Daria. Unfortunately, she betrays Daria. Yes. And she turns her back on Daria.
Yeah.
And it's something that she's very aware of, and feels very guilty about. And it kind of influences her decisions later on in the book.
So I want to go to a quote that speaks to just that. I'm on page 64. Is that the one? It's about a lot of the difficult decisions that people are making when they are with each other. So on page 64, get this. This is Lida. Her father had told her this. This is how you survive with your soul intact. Never name anyone. You saw nothing. You heard nothing. You have nothing to say. And there are a lot of this is after the suicide, and while they're trying to find the colleagues of
Pavel.
That I want to pronounce his name right, Pavel. They're trying to find connections, and I think that Heinrich, is that how you pronounce his name? This is the dad. This is Lida's dad.
Andre?
Andrej. Yeah. I think he was probably one of the most stunning characters. I remember him maybe the most, and it's been when I first contacted you, that's when I read the book. And since then, I've been doing a million things, so it's not completely fresh. But when I went back to read, he is such an interesting, complicated man, and probably a moral core to much of what Lida brings to the story. But your characters are all facing dilemmas about how to be in the situation that they're in, be in this country. And there's another quote that it relates to this, and I think this is something also Lida says. It's about friendship and about this country does not allow you to be the kind of friend you wish you could be to your friends, because it puts you in, this country does not allow you to be the kind of friend that you want to be. And I thought that was really powerful. So you're dealing a lot with friendship here. You're dealing with loyalty and an authoritarian regime when your own life is at stake. What was your journey into that world to create these characters who were living with those barriers to their code of ethics and to their friendships?
Well, I think the first character I started with, because it was a character that was really based on my own experience, is Tomáš. He's a sort of perpetual outsider. Today, he would be considered autistic. And I grew up, I mean, I didn't grow up at the same time as Tomáš, a little bit later, but early enough that the diagnostic tools for autism were not as developed as they are today. And a lot of people, I mean, I slipped through the cracks. I never was diagnosed until I reached adulthood. And when I was diagnosed, it really helped me to understand why I didn't fit in as a child and a teenager, why I was always an outcast, why I was the target of bullies or excluded. So essentially, that is, the same thing that Tomáš experiences. And but in his case, there was somebody I discovered in reading Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, that there was a Russian child psychiatrist who identified the characteristics of autism even before Kanner and Asperger did. But her research, because she was locked first under Stalin's regime and then behind the Iron Curtain, nobody else was familiar with her research after the 1920s. So Tomáš is under suspicion. I mean, he's always been bullied. And in fact, Stepan is one of his chief tormentors from way back when.
Yeah.
And he's always been bullied, and he's sort of been marked as somebody who's antisocial, that if you don't fit in, if you don't pitch in, if you don't do your share in this socialist utopia, you're by definition a person under suspicion. And he's from a privileged background. His father is the regional head of the Communist Party. And his father, on the one hand, the stakes are higher in the conformity that he demands of Tomáš. And on the other hand, he has the resources to protect Tomáš, as long as Tomáš meets a minimum standard of following the rules. And I grew up in Texas in a very conservative area. And, I was fairly privileged growing up. And that allowed me to be sheltered from a lot of the consequences that I may have faced otherwise because of my inability to read social cues, or the fact that people with bad motives took advantage of me, or my tendency to speak out when I saw injustice or inconsistency, even though I probably should have kept my mouth shut, or maybe not. So I sort of faced that. But again, like Tomasz, I was also timid. And I did not want to get in trouble. And that's why Tomasz, right at the beginning, and the premise of the story, or the sort of inciting incident of the story, is that Tomasz, who had promised to get Pavel in so he could plead their case for not only for opening, more of an opening and ending the censorship, and and having the books and the records and reopening the newspapers, Pavel also wanted an amnesty for those who had been arrested, himself included, for trying to stop the tanks from reaching Prague.
Yeah.
And then Tomasz, at the very last minute, he promised he would be there. He promised he would use his privilege to get them in. He bails on them and leaves them to try to carry on, Pavel and Stepan, to carry on by themselves when they don't have the privilege. And their mission fails. And Pavel then goes to his plan B, which is to follow in Jan Palach's footsteps.
Was he, and you have an interesting structure in that immediately you go to a flashback where he is in love with Lida, and there's a strong emotional core to choices that he's making, but he's also drinking heavily, and she refers to him as an alcoholic, and others do too.
He's on his way. Pavel is on his way. I mean, as opposed to Andrei, Lida's father, who, really is a pretty serious end-stage alcoholic. But Lida's aunt had warned her about, girls who choose boyfriends like their father. And Pavel is very much like her father. He's idealistic, and he's also in the process of being crushed, the same way that, being a resistance fighter, although ultimately, I guess, to some extent successful, Andrei was crushed. I think what really crushed him was that he was a communist and became disillusioned, as many of the Czechoslovak communists did in the face of Stalinist purges after the war.
They had been through so much.
Yes.
And the Soviets taking over was just, I can see that your whole soul is not able to function when one layer after one layer of your dignity, your rights, your freedom have not existed, and then exist less. And maybe the Ukrainian people have had independence and have had autonomy and have a thriving economy, and they're in a different time and a different mindset. The Czech people they didn't exist as a country. The country was taken away, and And
They did, however, they did have a country. In 1918, as a result of the end of World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which included the lands of Czechoslovakia, was broken up. And the country of Czechoslovakia was created in the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So were other countries of Central and Eastern Europe. However, between 1918 and 1938, Czechoslovakia was a thriving democratic country.
Yeah, before World War II.
But in the interwar period, it was a, there was industrial development, there was learning and education.
And it was multi-ethnic then too, wasn't it?
It was, and it was a very multi-ethnic country in in the interwar period, much more so than after World War II, because the Germans were expelled from the country after World War II. But it was the one strong democracy that developed out of the successor states to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the country was betrayed in Munich in 1938, when Germany was granted the Sudetenland, the Sudetes.
Okay.
Which is where the town in Torch is located.
Oh.
In that area that was ceded to Germany in 1938. And there's a reference to that because Tomasz's family lives in a home that was once inhabited by a prosperous German family. And Tomasz thinks about the fact that, these Germans were expelled because of the bad things that they did to the Czech people. And he's thinking about, what will people say who come and live in this home after us? So but yes, the country was betrayed. And if we don't support Ukraine, and if we make decisions like, Ukraine needs to cede territory to Russia for peace, that's exactly, and doing so without the agreement, without the consent and participation of the Ukrainian government, that is exactly what the Western powers and Hitler did in Munich. The Czechoslovak government was not even invited to the Munich conference.
Yes. So
Hitler got this Sudetenland, which included much of the border defense of Czechoslovakia, which made it significantly easier for German forces to come in and invade the country in March 1939 and forcibly separate Slovakia, which became a puppet regime led by a traitor who was subsequently executed at the end of World War II, and put the two other provinces, Bohemia and Moravia, under the Nazi regime. And the first governor of those, the first Nazi who ran these two provinces, was the notorious Reinhard Heydrich, who the Czechs assassinated in 1942. And the Nazis retaliated essentially by destroying two villages and killing thousands of civilians.
The history is
and there are references in Torch to the Heydrich assassination that was carried out by the Czech resistance, because that was that Andre was part of that resistance.
I wanted to talk a little bit about Stepan, who is a powerful force in this novel. And you created very different strengths. You gave each of them a power.
Mhm.
And you gave each of them a great frailty, as humans have.
Mhm.
And how did you, did he come from a Czech culture in your mind, or do you see that his strengths and his the complexity of being a bully and also, you know, reading poetry and falling in love with poetry that kind of saved him? Do you see that as kind of like a universal archetype, and he could be in many countries?
He could be in many countries, but I think there's a lot more of that in Central Europe because there's a long history of learning and everybody takes music lessons. I mean, music is just so important to people in the culture, but also learning. I mean, as I mentioned, the interwar Czechoslovakia was a place of great learning and science and art. I mean, well, Kafka, but he was certainly far from the only great writer who emerged during the interwar period in Czechoslovakia.
So you see Stepan as being like arising from that really beautiful time of Czechoslovakian history in the interwar time.
I would say, and the fact is that when I created, I mentioned Tomáš was the first character that I came up with.
Mm-hmm.
And Stepan was the second because he was the counterpoint. He was the chief tormentor.
Mm-hmm.
And his friendship with Pavel was the thing that changed him.
Hmm.
And a lot of that was because he was in love with Pavel.
Mm.
And when you're in love with somebody, that is such a powerful impetus to change. And it's just the power of love. And even though he knew that Pavel could never respond to his attraction in the same way, that it was still, I mean, he essentially hung on every word of Pavel. And Pavel was just this really sweet, soft, idealistic kid who really, was invested in making Stepan a better person. But of course, as Stepan learns, it's very hard to change those patterns. And he just struggles with that throughout the entire story. But he is the one that has the truly high stakes choice because he's arrested.
Yes.
And he knows that, he knows that Tomáš bailed on them. And Tomáš bears this responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
And he is being tortured to give up Tomáš's name.
Yes. And he doesn't ever do it.
And he never does.